I never expected that a plumbing disaster would change my life, but that's exactly what happened. For a year, my life had a predictable, quiet rhythm. It was measured in lines of code, cups of coffee, and the faint, muffled sounds of my neighbor, Caleb, living his life through the wall we shared. He was a constant, a presence I was acutely aware of but never truly knew. And then a pipe burst, and the quiet rhythm of my life shattered into 1,000 hopeful, terrifying pieces. My name is Miles. At the time, I was 28 and worked from home as a web developer. My apartment was my sanctuary and my office, a carefully curated space of neutral colors, organized bookshelves, and a single, thriving fiddle-leaf fig tree I was unreasonably proud of. I liked order. I liked predictability. It was a safe harbor from a world that often felt too loud and chaotic. My interactions were mostly digital, my social life minimal but comfortable. It was a life of solitude, but not necessarily loneliness. Or at least, that's what I told myself. Caleb was the opposite of my quiet, ordered world. He was a carpenter, and his energy seemed to radiate from him even when he was just carrying groceries up the stairs. He was always in motion, always doing something. I'd see him from my window, loading tools into his truck, his arms tanned and strong, a smudge of sawdust often decorating his cheek. He had a laugh that could carry across the courtyard, a deep, genuine sound that always made me stop what I was doing and listen. He was friendly in that easy, casual way some people are, offering a quick, "Hey, man," or a nod if we passed in the hallway. To me, he was a study in contrasts. He looked like the kind of guy who spent his weekends watching football and drinking beer with a dozen friends, all broad shoulders and effortless confidence. But sometimes, on warm evenings, I'd hear the soft, intricate notes of a classical guitar drifting from his apartment. The music was complex and melancholic, filled with a kind of thoughtful grace that seemed at odds with the rugged handyman I saw every day. It was this hidden detail, this secret melody, that fascinated me the most. I had constructed an entire narrative around him, of course. He was straight, probably had a girlfriend I never saw, and was completely, utterly unattainable. He was a background character in my life, a piece of the scenery, albeit a very distracting one. It was safer that way. Admiring from a distance required no risk, no vulnerability. It was an arrangement that suited my cautious nature perfectly. I could appreciate the sight of him, the sound of his guitar, the energy he brought to our quiet little building, all from the safety of my own apartment. I never imagined the boundary between our worlds was about to be washed away by a few hundred gallons of water. Life, however, has a funny way of ignoring the carefully constructed boundaries we set for ourselves. It has a way of taking your quiet, ordered life and turning it completely upside down with something as mundane as a faulty water heater. That's how life works sometimes, isn't it? The biggest changes are rarely announced with trumpets and fanfare. More often than not, they start with a frantic knock on the door late on a Tuesday night. The knock was sharp, insistent. It wasn't the gentle tap of a package delivery or the rhythmic rap of our elderly neighbor, Mr. Henderson. This was urgent. I pulled my headphones off, the silence of my apartment suddenly feeling vast. I opened the door to find Caleb standing there, his hair damp and sticking to his forehead, his t-shirt soaked through in patches. Water was squelching in his work boots. Behind him, I could hear a sound like a waterfall. "Miles, man, I am so sorry," he said, his voice tight with stress. He ran a hand through his wet hair, leaving it standing up in tufts. "My water heater, it exploded or something. The whole place is flooding." I could see the panic in his eyes, a flicker of helplessness that I'd never seen on his face before. He always seemed so capable, so in control of his physical world. Seeing him like this was disarming. I stepped into the hallway and peered toward his open door. Water was pouring out from under it, a steady stream that was already pooling on the worn linoleum. The sound was much louder out here, a relentless, rushing roar. "Oh, wow," was all I could manage to say. It was a completely inadequate response to the unfolding disaster. "Yeah, wow is right," he muttered, looking back at the deluge. "I've shut off the main valve, but the damage is done. It's everywhere. My landlord is out of town, and the emergency plumber can't get here for at least an hour." He looked back at me, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Look, I know this is a huge ask, but could I maybe just hang out here until the plumber comes?" My phone is about to die, and everything I own is currently becoming part of an indoor swimming pool. My mind raced. Caleb, in my apartment. For hours. It was a scenario my daydreams had touched upon, but my practical mind had always dismissed as pure fantasy. Now it was happening. Of course, I heard myself say, the words coming out before I had time to second-guess them. Yeah, come on in. Don't worry about it. He gave me a look of such profound relief it nearly buckled my knees. Thank you. Seriously. You're a lifesaver. He stepped inside, carefully trying to drip as little as possible onto my clean floors. He looked so out of place in my tidy, quiet space. He was all raw energy and frantic motion, a storm that had just breached the calm walls of my life. He stood awkwardly in the entryway, water pooling around his feet, looking around as if he'd entered a different dimension. You can, use my shower if you want, I offered, trying to sound casual. And I can find you some dry clothes. We look about the same size. This was a lie. He was broader in the shoulders and chest, more solidly built, but it felt like the right thing to say. He shook his head. No, man, you've done enough just letting me in. I'll just wait. But a shiver ran through him, a subtle tremor that betrayed his attempt at stoicism. He was cold and soaked, and the adrenaline was probably starting to wear off. Don't be ridiculous, I said, a surprising boldness taking over. Your apartment is flooding. The least I can do is offer you a towel. Go on. Bathroom's just there. I pointed down the short hallway. He hesitated for another moment, then nodded, a small, grateful smile touching his lips. Okay, thanks, Miles. The way he said my name, as if it was something he had taken care to remember, sent a ridiculous jolt through me. While he was in the shower, I found him a pair of my gray sweatpants and a plain black t-shirt. I laid them on the bed in my spare room, which was really just a storage room with a futon. My heart was pounding a steady, anxious rhythm against my ribs. This was all happening too fast. The carefully maintained distance between us had evaporated in an instant. Now he was in my shower, about to wear my clothes. The domesticity of it was both thrilling and terrifying. He emerged a few minutes later, his hair towel-dried and fluffy, wearing my clothes. And as I'd suspected, they were a little too snug on him. The t-shirt stretched across his chest, and the sweatpants clung to his thighs. Seeing him in my clothes, in my apartment, was surreal. The lines were blurring. The unattainable neighbor was suddenly very, very real, and standing 3 feet away from me in my living room. This is, way better, he said, tugging at the hem of the shirt. Thanks again. I owe you big time. He looked around my living room, really taking it in for the first time. His eyes scanned my bookshelves, lingering on the titles. He noticed my guitar propped up in the corner. You play? He asked, his voice softer now. I nodded, feeling a blush creep up my neck. A little. Just for myself. Mostly, it was my own secret, just like his classical guitar was his. It felt like a strange parallel, an invisible string connecting us that I had never known was there. He walked over to it, not touching it, but just looking at it with a familiar appreciation. Acoustic. Nice. I play a little classical myself. He said it so casually, as if it wasn't the very detail that had made him so endlessly fascinating to me. My carefully constructed image of him as just a rugged, one-dimensional handyman crumbled. I know, I said, and then immediately regretted it. The words just slipped out. He turned to look at me, a questioning look on his face. I mean, I hear it sometimes. I stammered, my cheeks burning. Through the walls. It's really good. A slow smile spread across his face. It wasn't a smirk, but something gentler. He looked almost shy for a second, a flicker of vulnerability that was gone as quickly as it appeared. Oh, well, sorry if it's ever too loud. No, never, I rushed to say. I like it. The honesty of the moment hung in the air between us. We were no longer just neighbors making small talk. We were two people who had just shared a small, genuine piece of ourselves. The plumber came and went, delivering the bad news. The damage was extensive. The water heater was shot, the flooring was ruined, and the drywall was soaked. It would be days, maybe even a week, before his apartment was habitable again. I heard all this from my living room, where I was pretending to work but was actually listening to every word. Caleb came back in, looking utterly defeated. He sank onto my couch and put his head in his hands. It's a complete gut job, he said, his voice muffled. They have to tear out the floor, the walls. My landlord is going to lose his mind, he sighed, a long, weary sound. I guess I'll find a cheap motel or something for the week. And there it was. The out. The chance for things to go back to normal. He'd go to a motel, and in a week, he'd be back in his apartment, and we'd go back to being strangers who exchanged nods in the hallway. The thought filled me with a surprising and immediate sense of dread. For the first time in a long time, my quiet, ordered life felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. You could stay here, I said. The words left my mouth with a will of their own. My brain was screaming, "What are you doing?" But my heart was doing something else entirely. I have a spare room. It's not much, but there's a futon. It's better than a motel. Caleb looked up at me, his eyes wide with surprise. Are you serious? I couldn't ask you to do that. I've already imposed enough. It's no imposition, I insisted, my voice firmer than I felt. It's an empty room. It's stupid for you to pay for a motel when there's a perfectly good place right here. Besides, I added, trying for a bit of levity, it'll be easier for you to keep an eye on the repair work. He stared at me for a long moment, really looking at me. It felt like he was seeing past the quiet neighbor and trying to understand the person underneath. I held my breath, waiting for his answer. It felt like a pivotal moment, a fork in the road of my very predictable life. Finally, he nodded slowly. If you're absolutely sure, he said, his voice thick with gratitude. Miles, I don't know what to say. Thank you. And just like that, he was no longer a visitor. He was my roommate. The storm wasn't just passing through. It had made landfall right in the middle of my living room. And a terrified, hopeful part of me didn't want it to ever leave. The first few days were a dance of careful politeness. We moved around each other in the small apartment, hyper-aware of the new proximity. I tried to stick to my work routine, sitting at my desk with my headphones on, but I couldn't focus. My entire consciousness was tuned to his presence in the next room. The sound of his breathing while he slept on the futon, the clink of a coffee mug in the kitchen, the low rumble of his voice on the phone with contractors and insurance agents. He was a surprisingly considerate house guest. He was tidy, quiet, and always insisted on cleaning up. He'd spend most of the day dealing with the chaos of his apartment, coming back in the evenings covered in dust and looking exhausted. We'd make small talk about the progress of the repairs or the weather. It was simple, surface-level stuff, but underneath it, I could feel a new current of connection forming. One evening, I was making a simple dinner of pasta when he came in. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame. Smells good, he said. He looked tired, a line of worry etched between his brows. It's just pasta, I said with a shrug. There's plenty if you want some. It felt so domestic, so normal. An hour later, we were sitting at my small dining table, eating together. The silence wasn't awkward, it was comfortable. We were two people sharing a meal at the end of a long day. You know, he said, pushing a piece of garlic bread around his plate. It's funny. We've lived next to each other for, what, a year? And I don't think we've ever said more than 10 words to each other. 12, I think, I joked. I counted. He looked up and laughed, a real, genuine laugh that filled the room. It was the sound I had only ever heard from a distance, and hearing it up close, directed at me, was intoxicating. You're a funny guy, Miles. Only on Tuesdays, I replied, feeling a newfound confidence bubble up inside me. The tension I usually felt around attractive men was slowly being replaced by a comfortable ease. With Caleb, it was different. Maybe it was the forced intimacy of the situation, but it felt like we'd skipped the awkward first steps and landed somewhere much further along. It was on the fourth night that something shifted. He came home later than usual, looking more drained than I'd ever seen him. He dropped his keys on the counter with a loud clatter and sighed heavily. He told me the insurance company was being difficult, that the repairs were going to cost more and take longer than he thought. He seemed smaller somehow, the usual confidence that radiated from him completely gone, replaced by a raw vulnerability. He sank onto the couch and just stared at the blank television screen. I sat down in the armchair opposite him, not knowing what to say. Offering platitudes felt hollow, so I just sat with him in the quiet, letting him know he wasn't alone. After a few minutes, he spoke, his voice low. You know what I miss the most? He asked, not looking at me. It's not the TV, or my bed, or any of my stuff. It's my guitar. He finally turned his head to look at me. It's the only thing that really settles my brain, you know? The contractors got it out for me. It's safe. But I can't play it. All my sheet music is a soggy mess. And in that moment, I saw him. Not the strong, capable carpenter from next door, but a man who was overwhelmed and just wanted a moment of peace. I saw the artist who played those beautiful, melancholic melodies through the wall. I have a few classical books, I offered quietly, from when I tried to learn. I was terrible at it, but the books are still on the shelf. His eyes lit up with a flicker of his old energy. Really? I nodded, and he followed me to the bookshelf. I pulled out a dusty book of simple Bach pieces. He took it from me, his fingers brushing against mine. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a shock wave through my system. It was the first time we had touched. I pulled my hand back as if I'd been burned. I don't know if he noticed. His attention was entirely on the book. He flipped through the pages, a small smile forming on his lips. "I know this one," he murmured. He looked at my guitar, then at me, a silent question in his eyes. "Go ahead," I said, my voice a little breathless. He picked up my guitar as if it were something sacred. He settled onto the couch, the instrument resting comfortably in his lap. And then he began to play. The music that filled my small apartment was a world away from the simple notes I usually coaxed out of it. It was rich and full and heartbreakingly beautiful. He played with a practiced ease, but his eyes were closed, his face a mask of intense concentration and release. He wasn't performing. He was communing. I watched him mesmerized. This was the man I had been listening to for a year, the artist I had only ever imagined. And he was right here, in my living room, sharing this incredibly intimate piece of himself with me. The music washed over me, and with it came a powerful, undeniable wave of affection. It was more than a crush on a handsome neighbor. It was a deep, resonant connection to the vulnerable, talented man sitting in front of me. In that moment, surrounded by the sound of his music, I knew I was in serious trouble. He finished the piece, the last note hanging in the air like a held breath. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotion. He opened his eyes and looked at me, a faint, self-conscious flush on his cheeks. "Sorry," he said. "I kinda got carried away." "Don't be," I whispered. "That was amazing, Caleb." He gave me a small, grateful smile that made my chest ache. The wall between us, the one I had so carefully maintained, wasn't just breached anymore. It was completely gone, and I had no idea what to do next. The next day, the atmosphere in the apartment was different. It was charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. The small, intimate concert of the previous night had changed something fundamental between us. We were both acutely aware of it. We avoided looking at each other for too long. Our movements were hesitant, and the easy banter we developed was replaced by a tense silence. The space that had started to feel comfortable and shared now felt small and confining, filled with everything we weren't saying. I tried to lose myself in work, but the code on my screen was just a meaningless jumble of characters. My mind kept replaying the image of Caleb playing my guitar, the look of concentration on his face, the way his fingers moved over the frets. I replayed the accidental touch of our hands, the electric jolt that had shot up my arm. Was it just me? Did he feel it too? Or was I projecting my own feelings onto a simple, friendly gesture? The uncertainty was agonizing. That evening, he came home with takeout from our favorite Thai place. It was a gesture of peace, an attempt to bridge the strange new gap between us. But even as we ate, the tension lingered. We talked about his apartment, about my work, about anything and everything except what was really on our minds. Every time our eyes met, I saw a flicker of the same confusion and uncertainty I felt. It was like we were both standing on the edge of a cliff, afraid to look down, but even more afraid to step back. After dinner, he was helping me with the dishes. I was washing, and he was drying, our shoulders occasionally brushing in the narrow kitchen. Each touch was like a small static shock. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it over the sound of the running water. I was rinsing a plate when a bit of water splashed onto his shirt. "Sorry," I mumbled, my face flushing. "No worries," he said, his voice a little rough. He didn't move away. He just stood there, closer than he needed to be. I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his soap mixed with something that was just uniquely him. I turned off the water, the sudden silence deafening. I could hear him breathe. He was so close. I looked up at him, and his gaze was intense, searching. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. This was the moment. And then he took a step back, breaking the spell. He ran a hand over the back of his neck, a nervous gesture I was starting to recognize. I should probably go make some calls, he said, his voice strained. He turned and practically fled the kitchen, leaving me standing there with my hands still in the sink, my heart hammering against my ribs. I leaned against the counter, my legs feeling weak. What was that? What had just almost happened? The air was thick with possibility, with a tension so palpable you could cut it with a knife. He had felt it too. I was sure of it now. He had felt it, and he had run. The realization was both a relief and a new kind of agony. It confirmed I wasn't crazy, but it also suggested he wasn't willing or able to act on it. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind a relentless loop of the past few days. I thought about the easy way he had fit into my life, the way his presence had filled the quiet spaces I hadn't even realized were empty. I thought about his laugh, his vulnerability, the beautiful music he made. I was falling for him, hard and fast, and it was terrifying. He was my neighbor. He was my temporary roommate. And he was, most likely, straight and confused by a weird moment of forced intimacy. I heard a noise from the living room. It was Caleb, pacing. I could hear the soft thud of his bare feet on the hardwood floor, back and forth, back and forth. He was restless, too. He was struggling with this as much as I was. The thought gave me a sliver of hope, but it was a fragile thing, easily crushed by fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of making things impossibly awkward. Fear of losing the fragile friendship we had started to build. The next morning, he was gone before I woke up, leaving only a hastily scribbled note on the counter. Went to the site early. See you tonight. The apartment felt cavernously empty without him. The silence I had once cherished now felt oppressive. I spent the day in a fog of anxiety, jumping at every sound, checking my phone constantly, even though I had no reason to expect a message from him. When he finally came home that evening, the tension between us was unbearable. We barely spoke. He went into the spare room and closed the door. I stayed in the living room, pretending to read a book, but the words just swam in front of my eyes. This couldn't go on. The unspoken thing between us was growing, taking up all the air in the apartment. Someone had to say something, but it wasn't going to be me. I was a professional at avoidance, an expert in protecting my own heart. Around 10 o'clock, there was a soft knock on my bedroom door. I knew it was him. My heart leaped into my throat. Yeah, I called out, my voice sounding shaky even to my own ears. The door opened a crack, and he poked his head in. Hey, can we talk for a minute? He asked. His face was pale, his expression serious. He looked nervous. Sure, I said, sitting up straighter in my bed. Come in. He didn't come in. He just stood there in the doorway, hesitating. Then he shook his head slightly, as if changing his mind. Actually, can you come out here? He asked, his voice low. In the hall, it was a strange request, but I was in no position to question it. I got up and followed him out of my apartment, my socked feet silent on the floor. He closed my apartment door behind us, leaving us standing in the dim, neutral space of the building's hallway. The air was cool and smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner. Caleb, what's going on? I asked, my anxiety spiking. Why were we in the hallway? Was he leaving? Was this his way of telling me he couldn't stay anymore, that this was all too weird for him? He leaned against the wall opposite my door, not looking at me. He stared down at his feet. I'm so confused, Miles, he said, his voice barely a whisper. This whole week, being here with you. He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. My heart ached for him, for his confusion, for my own. It's okay, I said, even though nothing felt okay. It's a weird situation. Forced proximity. It messes with your head. I was trying to give him an out, an easy explanation for the tension between us. He finally looked up at me, and his eyes were full of a desperate, raw emotion that stunned me into silence. Is that what you think this is? He asked, his voice cracking. Forced proximity? He pushed himself off the wall and took a step toward me. Then another. He moved with a sudden, startling intensity that pinned me in place. Before I could process what was happening, he was right in front of me, crowding my space, his body radiating a nervous, kinetic energy. He raised his hands, and for a split second, I thought he was going to push me away. Instead, his hands closed around my wrists. His grip wasn't painful, but it was firm, undeniable. He gently but deliberately pinned my arms against the wall on either side of my head. My back was flush against the cool wood of my own apartment door. I was trapped. My breath hitched. My entire world narrowed to the few inches between us. I could see the frantic pulse beating in his neck. I could see the conflict warring in his dark eyes. He stared at me, his gaze dropping to my lips, and then back up to my eyes. The silence in the hallway was absolute, broken only by the sound of our ragged breathing. He came here just to talk, but this wasn't talking. This was something else entirely. This was a confession without words. "Caleb," I breathed, my voice barely audible. It was both a question and a plea. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. I can't think straight when I'm near you." And then he closed the remaining distance between us. His lips met mine, and it wasn't gentle or hesitant. It was desperate and hungry, a raw collision of confusion and longing and a week's worth of unspoken tension. It was a kiss that consumed all the air in the hallway, all the thoughts in my head. All that existed was the pressure of his mouth on mine, the solidness of his body against me, and the firm, possessive grip he had on my wrists. The world tilted on its axis, and in that one, shattering moment, nothing was ever the same. The kiss ended as abruptly as it began. He pulled back, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and terror, as if he couldn't believe what he had just done. He let go of my wrists and stumbled back a step, putting space between us again. The heat of his touch lingered on my skin. My own hands felt strangely light, tingling where he had held them. I'm sorry," he stammered, shaking his head. "I shouldn't have done that. I'm so sorry, Miles." And then, before I could find my voice, before I could say a single word to tell him it was okay, to tell him it was what I wanted, he turned and fled. He didn't go back into my apartment. He went down the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the quiet building, and I heard the heavy front door of the building slam shut behind him. I stood there in the hallway, my back still pressed against my apartment door, my lips still tingling from the force of his kiss. I slowly raised my fingers to touch them, half convinced I had imagined the entire thing. But the feeling was real. The ache in my chest was real. He had kissed me, and then he had run away. I stumbled back into my apartment, closing the door and leaning against it, my legs finally giving out. I slid down to the floor, my mind a chaotic whirl of elation and despair. It had happened. The thing I had secretly, desperately hoped for had actually happened. But the aftermath was a disaster. He thought he had made a mistake. He was so terrified by his own actions that he had literally run out into the night. The silence of my apartment was suffocating. His scent lingered in the air, a phantom presence that mocked me. The sweatpants and t-shirt I had lent him were still folded neatly on the futon in the spare room. His toothbrush was still by my sink. He had left everything behind. He had left me behind. The next 24 hours were the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. I replayed the kiss over and over in my head, analyzing every detail. The desperation in his eyes, the roughness of his touch, the sheer panic on his face when it was over. He hadn't just kissed me. He had completely lost control, and it had scared him to death. I went through every possible scenario. Maybe he was drunk, though I knew he hadn't been. Maybe he was just confused and lonely after the flood. Maybe he was experimenting, and I was just a convenient, safe option. Or maybe, just maybe, he felt the same way I did, and the intensity of it had overwhelmed him. This last thought was the one I clung to, the tiny ember of hope I tried to protect from the howling winds of my anxiety. He didn't come back that night. He didn't come back the next morning. His phone went straight to voicemail. I was sick with worry. I paced the apartment, the same way he had the night before, wearing a path in the floorboards. I was terrified that I had scared him off for good, that our fragile connection had been shattered by one moment of uncontrollable passion. I felt so stupid. I should have said something. I should have grabbed his arm, told him not to go. I should have kissed him back with just as much force to show him he wasn't alone in this. But I had been frozen, stunned into silence by the suddenness of it all. And now, my silence might have cost me everything. The awkwardness of the previous days was nothing compared to this gaping, painful void. Late the next afternoon, I was sitting on my couch, staring blankly at my laptop, when there was a knock on the door. My heart stopped. It couldn't be him. It was probably Mr. Henderson asking to borrow some sugar. I didn't move. The knock came again, softer this time, more hesitant. With a deep, shaky breath, I got up and walked to the door. I looked through the peephole, and my breath caught in my chest. It was him, Caleb. He was standing there, looking exhausted. His hair was a mess, and he had dark circles under his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept either. He was holding a small, crumpled paper bag in one hand. My hand trembled as I unlocked the door and opened it. We stood there for a long moment, just looking at each other. The air was thick with 1,000 unspoken words. He looked just as scared as I felt. Can we just talk?" he finally asked, his voice low and hoarse. "For real this time?" I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. I stepped back to let him in, and he walked past me into the living room. He didn't sit down. He just stood in the middle of the room, turning to face me. The silence stretched on, taut and fragile. He looked from me, to the floor, and back to me again, struggling to find the words. The vulnerability I had seen in him before was now laid completely bare. There was no confidence left, no easy charm. There was just a man who was terrified. "First of all," he began, his voice shaky, "I am so sorry, Miles, for what I did in the hallway, and for running off like that. It was cowardly, and it was unfair to you. I freaked out. I finally found my voice. It's okay, Caleb." "No," he said, shaking his head emphatically. "It's not okay. I put you in a terrible position. I forced myself on you." "You didn't force yourself on me," I said, my voice quiet but firm. I took a step closer to him, needing to close some of the distance between us. "But you did run away. Why?" It was the only question that mattered. He let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked down at the crumpled bag in his hand, as if just remembering it was there. "I've been walking around for hours. I think I ended up on the other side of town. I had to think." He looked up, his eyes meeting mine. They were filled with a raw, painful honesty. "I've never done that before, Miles. I've never felt that way about a guy before." My heart ached with a sudden, sharp empathy. The confusion, the fear. I knew it well. "Oh," was all I could manage to say. "It's not just the flood, or being here," he continued, the words tumbling out in a rush, as if a dam had broken. "It's been longer than that. I noticed you months ago. The way you're so quiet, the way you take care of your plants." He gestured vaguely toward my fiddle leaf figure. "And the music from your apartment. I thought you were interesting. And then this whole mess happened with my apartment, and I asked to stay here because I wanted an excuse to get to know you." The confession hung in the air, stunning me into silence. The flood wasn't just a random disaster. It was an opportunity he had seized. "I told myself I was just being friendly," he said, a self-deprecating laugh escaping his lips. "That I was just curious. But being here, with you, in your space, it became impossible to ignore. Every time you laughed, every time we talked, I just wanted to be closer to you. And last night, in the kitchen, and it scared me. So I ran." He took a deep breath. "And then I came back to talk, to try and explain myself, to put things back in a neat little box. But I saw you standing there in the hallway, looking at me with so much kindness, and I couldn't hold it in anymore. I just broke. I closed the remaining distance between us, until I was standing right in front of him. I could see the tears welling in his eyes. "Caleb," I said softly, "I get it if you want me to leave." He rushed on, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll pack my stuff and go. I get it if you never want to speak to me again. I had to tell you the truth. You deserve that." I reached out and gently took the crumpled bag from his hand, setting it on the coffee table. Then I took his hands in mine. They were cold and trembling. "You didn't break," I said, looking directly into his eyes, trying to pour all the understanding and reassurance I could into my gaze. "And I don't want you to leave." A single tear escaped and traced a path down his cheek. "You don't," he whispered, his voice full of disbelief. "The only thing you did wrong," I said, my voice steady, "was run away after you kissed me. Because I wanted you to kiss me. I've wanted you to for a very long time." His face crumpled with relief, a sob catching in his throat. And then I was the one moving forward. I was the one closing the distance. I leaned in and kissed him. This time, it was different. There was no desperation, no panic. It was slow and gentle and full of a year's worth of quiet longing. It was a kiss of acceptance, of understanding. He responded immediately, his hands coming up to cup my face, his thumbs gently stroking my cheeks. It was a kiss that felt like coming home. When we finally broke apart, we just rested our foreheads against each other, breathing the same air. "So," he said, a watery laugh in his voice, "I guess we should probably talk about this." I smiled, my heart feeling lighter than it had in my entire life. "Yeah," I said. "I guess we should." He was still my neighbor whose apartment was a disaster. I was still the quiet web developer who was scared of everything. But in that moment, none of it mattered. We had found each other through the wall, and now, finally, there was nothing standing between us. In the weeks that followed, everything changed, and yet, in some ways, nothing did. Caleb stayed with me, but he was no longer a house guest sleeping on the futon. He was the man I woke up next to, the one whose laughter filled my apartment in the mornings and whose music lulled me to sleep at night. We moved from the tentative, terrifying moments of confession into the easy, comfortable rhythm of a relationship. It was a rhythm I had never known, but one my soul recognized instantly. We learned about each other in 1,000 small ways. I learned that he hated olives, that he could name almost any type of wood by its grain alone, and that his tough exterior hid a deeply sensitive and thoughtful man who cried during sad movies. He learned that I need at least 2 cups of coffee before I can form a coherent sentence, that I hum when I'm concentrating on my code, and that my quiet nature wasn't aloofness, but a form of deep observation. His apartment was eventually repaired, the floors replaced, the walls repainted. The day he was supposed to move his things back in, a strange sadness settled over me. I had grown so used to his presence, to the delightful clutter of his existence merging with my own ordered life. I was standing in my doorway, watching him carry a box across the hall, when he stopped and looked at me. "This is stupid," he said, setting the box down. He walked back to me, a serious look on his face. "Why am I moving 5 feet away when all I want to do is be here with you?" That night, we moved my futon into his newly repaired spare room, and he officially moved his toothbrush back into my bathroom. We kept both apartments, our own little kingdoms spanning the hallway, but we lived in mine. It had become our home. Sometimes, late at night, when we're curled up on the couch, I'll think back to the man I used to watch from my window. The handsome, unattainable neighbor who I thought was living a completely different life in a completely different world. It's funny how wrong you can be about people, how wrong you can be about the perceived distance between 2 lives. You build walls around your heart for protection, you create neat, tidy narratives to make sense of the world. And then life, in the form of a burst pipe or a nervous confession in a dimly lit hallway, comes along and shows you that the only walls that ever really existed were the ones you built yourself, and that the most beautiful things are waiting just on the other side.